Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to episode 116 of the Writ Podcast. It's the last episode of the year, and so it's time to take a look back on the political year that was. And joining me to do that is the CBC's Aaron Wherry and Stephanie Levitz of the Toronto Star. Thanks for being here.
Hey.
So the format here was going to be pretty simple. I know these year-end episodes usually are all the same, so hopefully we'll try to be a little bit original. But generally, we're going to go through each party, talk about what the last year kind of revealed about them, what we learned about them over the last year, and then what questions we still have going into the next year. So we'll go party by party and start with the incumbent government, the Liberals. Aaron, why don't you kick us off? What did 2023 reveal about Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party?
I think it just proved that gravity is real. If you took a step back and said, if you took the names off and you knew nothing about Canadian politics and you said the Liberal government is in office, it's been in office for a little over 8 years now, inflation is up, interest rates are up, housing costs are up, what do you think the polls would look like? I think you would probably guess roughly in the range of what they're at right now. I don't think that I don't say that to mean that the Liberals don't have any responsibility for their current predicament. But I think they are facing some sort of ironclad rules of politics that are tough to get away from. And I do think that their fall has been, or I should say their summer, their kind of midpoint of the year was particularly rough. And that I think goes to the fact that, I feel like we had this conversation last year. They're slow off the mark. They were slow off the mark on inflation. They were slow off the mark on housing. And I think that's a significant piece of why they're trailing in the polls right now. But I also think, stepping back and looking at sort of the objective fundamentals, I think that also explains a lot of where they are.
Aaron, does that mean that they should have been better prepared then for that cyclical thing than they just weren't?
I think to a certain extent, yeah. I talked to the Prime Minister, actually. I was thinking about this the other day. I did an interview with him last December, and I asked him whether they were slow off the mark on inflation, like whether they could have moved faster. And he kind of conceded that they were. And that's, I think that's interesting in the fact that you think about how much Pierre Poilievre was talking about housing and how much other people were talking about housing before the Liberals sort of snapped into action in the fall. It does feel a bit like, very recent history repeating itself, that they, instead of kind of seeing where the discussion was going, they became reactive instead of proactive. And I think that's a big part of the problem.
Stephanie, what do you think what we learned about the Liberals over the past year?
We learned that there still remains some power and heft in the backbench. I think we saw that most notably with the sort of fall, I think it was in the fall, right? The pivot on the carbon tax and carbon pricing with the enhanced carve out for rural Canadians and the removal of the carbon pricing on home heating fuel. I mean, that was a classic example of a group of backbench MPs. I think I'm speaking, metaphorically, but I imagine this could have happened, grabbing the Prime Minister by the shoulders and saying, listen, if you don't fix this, we are going to be destroyed in Atlantic Canada. You need to do this. And so I think that that's a really interesting thing, because what tends to happen with governments, right, when they get long in the tooth, is that you have a bunch of grumbly backbenchers who see the fact that they're never going to be in cabinet. And certainly this summer cabinet shuffle definitely did irritate a lot of people on the backbench. But instead of breaking ranks, instead of forming some kind of breakaway caucus, they just went to the boss and said, you better fix this. And he listened. And I think that there's something to be said for that. I think even after all this time, I mean, it seems that, to Aaron's point, the Liberals far too often are reactive, and they're far too often convinced of their own righteousness and believing that their way is the right way. And a few times this year, they've been showed up in that. And there's been a lot of perhaps humility there, forcing them to change course, forcing them to pivot, not just on home heating fuel, but on foreign policy, their approach, let's say, to the alleged assassination by Indian state agents, all of these things. There was a pivot there in how they dealt with things, I think based in part on wanting to show that they can still listen and act on what they hear.
Stephanie, you mentioned the caucus kind of coming to Trudeau and asking him to do this. Up to now, or up to this year, Was it just that the caucus felt that they owed everything to Trudeau, and now they're starting to feel a little bit like maybe Trudeau owes them something?
I mean, I think, and I remember talking to some Liberals in the summertime, and they were dividing the current caucus into different classes, right? So you have the class in the caucus that's, let's say, pre-2015 that have been around forever. There's not that many of them, but they exist. Then you have a not insignificant chunk of caucus, the class of 2015, who explicitly owe their job to Justin Trudeau. They would not have gotten elected. It's like the orange wave of Jack Layton when all of these MPs suddenly found themselves elected unexpectedly. There's a lot of Liberals from the class of 2015 who owe their seats, their jobs, to Justin Trudeau specifically. Then you get into the class of 2019 and the class of 2021, who you could argue in some degree won their seats in spite of Justin Trudeau. So there's different generations there in caucus. And I think that some of them, yes, are flexing some muscles now because they don't feel like they actually owe their jobs to Justin Trudeau, and they'd like to keep their jobs. That's the other bit of it, right? I mean, Trudeau has been pretty clear he's going to run in the next election. That's all fine and well. But chances are, he is in the downward trajectory of his career. Like just again, simple math, whether the Liberal government wins or loses, realistically, how much longer can Justin Trudeau stay as leader of the Liberal Party? However, if you're a backbench MP from rural Nova Scotia who just got elected in 2019 or 2021, you could have another 20 years in politics if you wanted it. So there's some degree of long game, I think, getting played here too.
So when we're looking ahead to 2024 then, what don't we still know? What are we still wondering about this party that might be revealed in the next year, Aaron?
I mean, I think there's sort of two things. One is whether Trudeau's standing with the public is to some degree beyond repair, or is so bad that it's an anchor on the party. I don't know that we quite have an answer on that question. I mean, obviously his personal numbers are down, but I don't know that we know it's unrecoverable or that it's dragging the party downward. And the other part, I think, is can they get back on their front foot and countering the reactive thing that we've seen the last 2 years, be more proactive and be better on top of things and driving an agenda and a narrative that seems to not just be responding to whatever Pierre Poilievre happens to be saying at any given day.
Stephanie, what do you think?
One of the things I think we don't know is something that has befuddled the Liberals all year long is what crises lurk on the world stage. They're going to throw them off their agenda because this government, through I think no fault of its own in numerous instances, has been dealt with crises after crisis after crisis. And that throws off whatever agenda, like whatever good intentions they might have to do X, Y, and Z. Along comes a war in the Middle East, a war in Ukraine, a global pandemic, all sorts of things that continually force them to recalibrate. And that's hard. That's hard for governance. And one wonders, whether they're learning from that, again, going back to the reactive, proactive points of view. Like, is there someone in PCO? I'd like to think there is. And in PMO, sort of casting an eye over the global landscape and trying to sort of get ahead of what might be coming, foresee some of these things to the best that they can, and then adjust accordingly as policy requires. Sometimes it doesn't, obviously, but sort of, some future forecasting there to how the winds might change in 2024 and how they'll have to adjust, not just as the Liberal Party, but as the government.
Well, I'd like to hear from both of you on that because there's a kind of a big thing happening in 2024 south of the border, a little bit of a U.S. presidential election, possibility that Donald Trump will win that election. And if he loses it, possibility that people are upset about that and things happen. How are they going to set themselves up for that? Stephanie, I don't know if you want to start us off on that, but like it's going to be a year where a lot of Canadians are going to be looking at what's happening in the United States rather than what the Liberal government is doing here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways the government has to approach this, right? One is from a raw policy perspective, like take a look at the platforms, figure out, if whoever wins, what does that mean for Canada-U.S. relations, global trade, all of these things. I mean, I think, the Canadian government is in, say, a fortunate position, but at least in a different position than they were in the last presidential cycle where Donald Trump was running for the first time as president, was making it clear, for example, he was ripping up NAFTA. That was big, right? Where I don't know that we're there yet in terms of how or what Mr. Trump would like to do that could have the same implications for the Canada-U.S. relationship. I'm sure it'll come. So to some degree, they're better armed, right? What is it? Forewarned is forearmed or something, that expression? Like, they kind of know how to deal with him. They know how to deal with the people around him. It's not the same, though, right? There's not the same folks that are simply around him that could have a pipeline between the White House and PMO the last time. But I do think it's already on their minds. I do think they're thinking about it when we talk about forward casting and how they react to that. What I think is also, though, interesting is the extent to which they are using Donald Trump and his policies and his party as a stick to beat Pierre Poilievre with. And I find that tension kind of interesting because they are inflaming Canadians' fears and thoughts about what a Trump administration might be like, what those politics are like, to paint the other guy. But if the Liberals win government, if Trump wins, the Liberals also have to deal with him. So it's a weird strategy to me that I find hard to parse out. Like, at some point, does that run its course and they have to stop? I don't know.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think that the second part was something I was going to point out too, that they, I think there's sort of two things for the Liberals as the presidential election gets closer. One is the demands for them to talk, for the Prime Minister in particular, to talk about what's happening in the United States, particularly if Donald Trump is the Republican candidate. Those demands from people in our line of work are just going to increase, and people are going to be asking for comment about whatever latest thing is that he's said or done. And given the fears about what his election could mean for the long-term future of American democracy, those questions are going to come to the fore. And they're going to have to decide when they want to comment and when they don't. They're somewhat used to that experience, having done it from 2016 to 2020, but they're going to have to, go through that exercise again and figure out when to comment and when not to. But the flip side of that is they are also going to be, I think you're already seeing it, kind of sending the message of, you see what's happening in the United States, we don't want it to happen here, et cetera, and trying to link Pierre Poilievre to that. And I do think it is, interesting that while they may not want to talk about Donald Trump or comment on him, they will freely say that Pierre Poilievre is leading the MAGA conservatives, and that is an implicit comment on Donald Trump. And so I don't know how that tension resolves itself. Maybe you're able to walk some kind of line where you don't directly criticize the Republican candidate and perhaps the future president, while also saying that you don't want whatever is happening in the United States to happen here. But I think it is going to be kind of a long-term tension for, at least the next 11 months.
Yeah. Speaking about the Conservatives, let's move on to them. Obviously a big year for Pierre Poilievre, his first full year as leader of the party. The party moves ahead in the polls by a significant amount, really the biggest lead we've seen in the Trudeau years at all for the Conservatives over the Liberals. Stephanie, what did we learn about the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre in 2023, aside from the fact that they can build a pretty big lead in the polls?
Yeah, and one of the things we learned, I would say, is what a difference discipline can make in a caucus, because this Conservative caucus under Pierre Poilievre is more disciplined in terms of its message and how it manages that message than probably any caucus since the Stephen Harper years. And the consistency of their messaging is part of the drive in the polls. They are only really, most of the time, talking about one or two things: the carbon tax and housing, and the economy sort of as a broader thing. These are the issues that, survey after survey says top of mind are top of mind for Canadians. So if you are talking about what Canadians are talking about, Canadians are going to listen to you. And I know that, folks in our line of work look at the question period back and forth, and we look at the statements, and we look at the varied scrums, and we, kind of sigh and say, okay, well, they've said that all already. But our job is to listen to it every day, all day long, right? I'll give an example. I just spent some time listening to every single one of the year-end interviews that Pierre Poilievre gave this week. And I was fascinated by the fact that they were all basically identical. And I thought, were the reporters handed scripts? And I'm actually thinking to myself, did they get scripts? Was there conditions? So I called a few of the hosts and I just asked, and they're like, what? No. And so to me, that tells you something, right? If every single radio host across this country is asking about the exact same set of issues, that says something about Poilievre's messaging, right? It's sort of, he is where the people are at, because these local radio hosts to me represent sort of more of a grassroots sensibility than we might in Ottawa, right? So I find that interesting. And I think what else we've learned is, or maybe it was a confirmation. If we use an analogy with Trump, a lot of folks said that when Trump was running for president and then became president, oh, he's going to pivot, and oh, he's going to moderate, and oh, this, and oh, that. And there was some degree of wondering if Mr. Poilievre was sort of going to do the same after he won leadership. Like, would he tone it down, or would he back off, or would he switch positions? And we learned that he didn't, and he won't. He will make mistakes along the way. He'll stop talking about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. He'll change positions, such as, tweak them a little. But he is the guy he is. He's the guy who ran for leader of the party, and he continues to be that guy. And I don't think he's going to change or moderate anything going forward. What you see is what you get.
I mean, that was one of the lessons that the Conservatives took from the 2020 leadership campaign and then Aaron O'Toole's general election, that the pivot doesn't really work, just makes it look inauthentic. So we'll see if they can keep that up. Steph, I just want to say, because you also mentioned the caucus discipline, is it your view, based on, observing how things are working on the Hill, is this just because they feel like they have a chance to win? And so, Harper was able to keep that caucus discipline in part because they were in power. Is it just that feeling that it's very close, or has Poilievre done something to keep the caucus disciplined?
A couple of things. I mean, I think one is that the message that he has instructed them all to go out to deliver is one they actually agree with. It's not politically polarizing to support the creation of more housing or to bring down inflation. I think the carbon tax one might be a bit trickier for some members of parliament in that caucus in terms of their constant, reverberations, axe the tax, axe the tax, axe the tax, but I even think with that, given the cost of living, conversation that is now happening in Canada, even more people are coming around to this question of, well, do we really need to pay this price on carbon at this time? So I think part of it is they believe in the message, and they feel like it's clear, and they feel like it's concise, and they like having marching orders, and they like having a fighter at the top. So I think they're happy to rally. I mean, from what I understand too, from my conversations with caucus, is that Mr. Poilievre listens to them. He does take feedback. He solicits their ideas and opinions. He allows, insofar as there is a lot of discipline, he does allow people to do their own thing as long as it's not too distracting. So there is some give and take there. And considering, again, how I think the caucus was run under Mr. O'Toole and prior to that, Mr. Scheer, it's a breath of fresh air for a lot of folks in there to feel like they're all rallying around a cause and definitely can see victory coming.
Aaron, what did we learn about the Conservatives in 2023?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily that we learned it. Maybe some people, I guess, but I think it's a reconfirmation of the fact that Pierre Poilievre is just a talented political communicator. Agree or disagree with what he says, he is quite effective at building a case and making that case, and holding attention and persuading people. I don't know how much of the Conservative polling lead right now is necessarily based on Canadians flocking to Pierre Poilievre, but he has hit on the issues that the Liberals are having the hardest time answering. And his ability to make arguments is testing the Liberals in ways that I don't think any of the leaders they've faced, that Justin Trudeau has faced on the Conservative side, have really tested them. That there's a lot of attention for that, 15-minute housing video that Pierre Poilievre put out. I confess I have no idea how much that has penetrated into the actual, broader public. And there are lots of ways you can argue with the arguments he makes in there, but his ability to string together an argument and, pull on certain facts and put them together to make an argument, I think is really interesting. And, I remember doing an interview with him when he was, I think, Democratic Reform Minister in the Harper government. And he said to me at some point, people think it's all about looking for the right words, the right message, the right slogan. And I do think he leans heavily on slogans, but he said something along the lines of like, I think people are looking for the right facts. And you can argue, I think, with the way he uses facts, but if you look at his speeches and you look at his communication, it's very number heavy. It's very focused on a few specific things. He puts the onus on the other side to rebut his arguments, and he does not sort of back down from a challenge. And I think that is, I think the Liberals are struggling to figure out how to deal with that.
All right. So what questions then remain for 2024? What don't we know about the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre, Aaron?
I think we don't know how well this is going to hold up. I think you saw in the last few weeks of December, or the last few weeks of the House sitting, that for all his skill as a communicator and all of the troubles the Liberals are having, there is still a certain propensity to get for him on Poilievre's part to get into trouble. And calling what happened at the border a terrorist attack, the too cute by half position on the Ukraine free trade modernization agreement, they can still get themselves into trouble. And I think it will be interesting to see how well they can, whether there are more of these sort of gaps that are going to come into play in the next little while. And I think there's still, the tensions that Aaron O'Toole couldn't navigate, that have always kind of been there in the Conservative Party between a kind of harder right base and moderate voters. As much as the Conservatives have maybe tried to paper over those divisions, I think they're still there. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether he can continue to kind of hold it together, or whether there are issues like, modernization of the Ukraine free trade agreement, stuff like that, where these issues are going to come up and continue to trip him up. I don't know that there's such a thing as peaking too early in politics, but it's, to hold a lead for 2 years is a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of forget that it's only been about 5-6 months that the Conservatives have been ahead so much in the polls, right? So it is going to be a new experience, because the Conservatives haven't enjoyed a lead like this since probably 2011 for an extended period of time. So, it's something new to be the front runner rather than sort of the underdog challenger of the government. Stephanie, what do you think? What are we still kind of waiting to figure out and learn about the Conservatives?
One of the things, a storyline that I think I'll be watching over 2024 is who is going to be running for the party under Pierre Poilievre. There are a lot of open seats, obviously, because they don't have that many of them, right? And we have riding redistribution, which sort of changes the game in some ridings as well. So, some MPs will move over into different ridings, opening up a spot. And who the party's nominating to run for it under Pierre will tell us a lot about what a Conservative government might in fact look like. Who are the up-and-comers also in the current caucus? Who is a Pierre Poilievre front bench, and what does that look like? And does the party start moving under Pierre Poilievre? Right now, some observers have made a comparison between the Conservatives as led by Pierre Poilievre and the Liberals as led by Justin Trudeau. In their own way, it's identical. The parties are both wrapped up in the brand of a single leader. And that's pretty dangerous, right? It can be dangerous if all of a sudden folks don't like your leader. Mr. Poilievre invested a lot of time, effort, money into a makeover this year, to make him, more approachable, I guess, in the eyes of viewers. And that's fine, but it can't just be the Mr. Poilievre show. I don't think caucus wants to see that. I think they want to be able to be pushed out and have positions of prominence. And so I think watching sort of how he navigates that, and to Aaron's point, I mean, you can't, and the Conservatives say this to themselves. I know they talk about it in caucus, don't take this for granted, don't get too cocky, don't make mistakes. But there are people in that caucus who I also think believe they're owed something. And keeping them, I think, specifically in the fold. No breakaways, no grumbling, no complaints, no Conservative sources say. That will be challenging, because as Aaron points out, it's a long time till the next election to keep people motivated. And there also becomes the question, where Mr. Poilievre falls on his back foot is when he's being challenged to respond to the news of the day, right? He couldn't really articulate a response on the India allegations. It took him the better part of a week to have anything public to say about the UN vote calling for a ceasefire and the war against Israel. Like there's certain topic areas where he is not comfortable. And unfortunately, if you want to be the prime minister of a G7 country, you need to talk about those topic areas. So just as Justin Trudeau's Liberals are going to need to be asked about Donald Trump, so is Mr. Poilievre. And he's going to have to be able to articulate some kind of response to how a Poilievre-led government would deal with X, Y, and Z that Mr. Trump is proposing to do, to say nothing of the politics itself of sort of that Republican wing of the party.
We're already seeing the Conservatives starting to nominate some candidates. They've named a few over the last few weeks. And presumably by the end of the year, we're probably approaching the time where some MPs announce that they won't run for re-election, right? So we might get an idea of sort of that, the renewal, who's going out and then who's going to come in to replace them. So I think that will be very interesting. Okay, so how about the New Democrats? Stuck with the Liberals in the CASA agreement or the Confidence and Supply Agreement. Maintaining their support in the polls, not really going up, not really going down. Aaron, what do you think? What did we learn about the New Democrats and Jagmeet Singh in this year? I
don't know if we learned it about the NDP or we learned it about confidence and supply agreements, but we learned that they're flexible. If you read the line of that agreement, right, it's you're going to have a Pharmacare Act enabling legislation. I can't remember whether it's introduced or passed by the end of 2023, but we're not going to get either. I think the NDP is still part of kind of this, live experiment in parliamentary cooperation in Canada. And it is interesting to see that, I think probably because there is some goodwill behind the scenes, but also because political reality is what it is, that, there is room apparently for flexibility with these things. And it's possible to work out compromises if you get to a point where what seemed to make sense a year and a half ago doesn't quite make sense now. I don't know how the pharmacare issue is going to resolve itself, because I think the NDP's greatest ambition and the Liberals' kind of fiscal reality and other priorities are a bit in conflict. There is probably a middle ground there. But, I think we're continuing to see kind of how an opposition party has to, or can, I guess, work within the limits of one of these deals, and how they can continue to claim credit or not as they're kind of navigating one of these deals.
Stephanie, what do you think? What we learned about the NDP?
There's an expression, and I don't know whose it is. You either get into politics to be someone, or you get into politics to do something. And maybe you guys know who actually said that. But what's interesting to me is, what is it that the NDP want to achieve, right? I think that's what we learned in 2023. Is it, in fact, as they say, which is they want to achieve meaningful difference for working class Canadians? Because if that's true, if that's the goal, if that's the ultimate ambition, well, they've knocked it out of the park, right? Like dental care for low income, less well-off Canadians will make an absolute meaningful difference in their lives. Like there is no doubt. It goes to the question of who are the NDP? What do they stand for? What do they want? It's, we're talking about wealth redistribution. We're talking about the implementation of a new social programs. I mean, in some ways, what they've managed to do is really transformative, and will give NDP leader Jagmeet Singh a legacy that probably outpaces that of many of the other recent New Democrat leaders we've seen in this country. If they get no political credit for that, are they okay with it? And maybe they are, right? Maybe the ultimate ambition, and maybe I'm either naive or cynical, is to acknowledge that, we're never going to form government. As the Liberals march further left, we will never form government. So, hey, why don't we use our power for good and make changes? That sounds like a very, kumbaya sort of way of looking at it. But I think that's sort of what we learned about the NDP, because their political ambition doesn't seem to be there. Like in terms of politics, in terms of governance, in terms of caring about the nitty gritty of the particular agreement. Oh, the deadline's flexible, schmexible, whatever, as long as we get what we want in the end. And I find that interesting. And I also find it interesting what we learned about the NDP in 2023 is nobody seems mad at Jagmeet Singh, right? Like within the party. Like you just think about his performances in the last election. They had a convention. a leadership review, you would think there'd be room in that party to come after him and say, okay, buddy, you know what? This isn't working out. We need better than this. Let's get a new leader. None of that. That's not there. So that's interesting to me too.
So Stephanie, then, if we're moving to the questions, are the questions, do we find out if the NDP wants to be someone or get something done? Or do we find out if people get angry at Jagmeet Singh? What's the questions for the NDP?
I think the question is, how much longer are they going to prop up the government? I really think that's it. I think it's at what point do they choose to pull the plug? Because, I mean, yes, of course, the Prime Minister can do that of his own volition at any time of his own choosing. Agreement be damned. But there is a not insignificant degree of power in the hands of the New Democrats. And I think the coming spring budget will sort of be the biggest tell in all of that, right? Like if they get what they want in the budget, they continue to prop up the government. Okay. They've said, okay, they're going to go all the way on this one. Or does something happen that makes them finally say, okay, we've had enough. We're out.
Aaron, is that the big question, or do you got something else?
Yeah, to me, it's funny. You look at the polls and you can either say the NDP support is rock solid or it's flatlining. And it's still, I think I'm always sort of hesitant because I covered the 2011 election. And if you told me that Jack Layton would ever break through and become official opposition leader, I would have said that was impossible. It was never going to happen. And then lo and behold, things went crazy for a few weeks. And so I think there's still some possibility of that happening for Jagmeet Singh and the NDP. I'm sure that's what the NDP is holding on to, that idea. But going to Steph's point, it is interesting that while they pursue these policy goals and achievements, their own support isn't budging. It's not coming up. They don't seem to be getting credit for it. And that's always been the question of smaller parties getting into parliamentary deals like this, is, are they going to get any credit for it? I do think there is a part of the NDP brain that says, yes, we'd like to win seats, but we would like to do some stuff. And if it comes down to choosing between the two, they might choose doing stuff. And so it's possible that's what's holding things together for them right now. But and it may go to this may also be related to the question of when they decide to, would they decide to walk away from the deal, is, if their support doesn't seem to be budging, there's no real reason for them to pull the plug. So I think I'm interested to see whether they have any kind of bump in the polls, and whether, if it just stays the same, whether there's any movement to try to change that at all, or whether they are really banking on sort of the public eventually coming around to the idea that they are the best progressive option, and that the Liberals are sort of, their day is done.
We can go quickly around this, just because the other parties are often left off of these kind of discussions, even though the Bloc is the third largest party in the House and is a potential dancing partner for the Liberals if the NDP decides to pull the plug. Greens are still there. Provincial Greens, just came off a win in Ontario, and the PBC still getting 2 to 4% of the vote. Either of you have a thought on any of those other parties and sort of the big kind of questions that are around them? Stephanie, why don't you go?
Pardon the pun that I'm about to make. The evergreen question about the Green Party, sorry, I went there, is at what point do they cease to exist in the political firmament of the House of Commons? And I don't mean that disparagingly to the legendary career of Elizabeth May, and the work that she has done truly championing the climate cause, both domestically and globally. But talk about a party that just cannot break through into the consciousness anymore. And, can they elect anybody besides Liz May and Mike Morris? Is that possible? And if it's not possible, then what does that mean? And I know these are very airy-fairy questions, because I don't know what they mean, but I do find that it seems increasingly their voice is absent from the national political discourse and debate in this country. They had maybe a heyday a decade ago, and it's just, I don't know how they find relevance as a national political organization in the current climate we're in. And conversely, you could say on the absolute opposite side of the partisan spectrum, you could say similarly about Maxime Bernier. And, talk about accountability from within a party, right? Like he's tried and tried and tried to win a seat in government, in parliament now. He's failed every single time, but remains the leader of a group of Canadians who really do believe that he speaks for their values and their causes, and that he's genuine in that, despite his previous political past and what he's said in the past or done in the past. Does he continue? What place does he occupy in Canada's political firmament? If he cannot win a seat, never mind the next election, but like there will be by-elections, will he try in those? I don't know. At what point does that organism sort of fizzle out? You know, Pierre Poilievre has made absolutely no secret of the fact that he is trying to pull some of Max's voters, people that currently support the PPC, back into the Conservative fold. You could suggest, you know, in the by-elections we had this year, specifically in Manitoba, that actually bore fruit. You could see it happen. So whither Maxime Bernier? And where does he go from here? And then, you know, those are the two tiny ones. And then you get to the Bloc Québécois and how often their fortunes are tied to the Quebec electoral reality, right? And how they become sort of the, you know, Preston Manning used to have that expression, you need a pop-off valve for populism. And in some degree, when it comes to advocating for Quebec, the Bloc Québécois have always been that pop-up valve federally, like pop-off. We'll channel our anger, we'll channel our frustration, we'll give it to the Bloc. I don't see that easing necessarily. So can they hold on to that? And what kind of voice do they continue to be in the House of Commons, both for Quebec, but what that, again, in a minority government situation, what that means. What's interesting for them, I would say in 2024, is to see where they go with the Conservatives. I found it very interesting this year when Pierre Poilievre decided to start going after the Bloc Québécois. He started attacking them, therefore reducing any potential dance partner for him should he win a minority government. And I wonder if the Bloc remains the one rump in the Commons where Poilievre could find some commonality. Do the two sides need to build that relationship looking down the road to 2025?
I'd say it's looking tough.
For
a long time, there seemed to be a lot of discontent between Blanchette and Singh. But now I find it's even more with the Conservatives. They seem really annoyed with them. But anyway, we'll see. I don't know how they can get together. Aaron, do you have thoughts about any of these other parties?
I do think the PPC is the interesting question. Like coming out of the 2021 election, you know, it was possible to believe that maybe they had established themselves as something. You know, conversely, it was also possible to believe that it was sort of strictly a product of the pandemic. But I don't think they have, whatever their sort of popular support, I don't think the party has shown itself capable of kind of functioning as an organization, of being a real organizing power. I don't quite know where they go from here, especially because, you know, Pierre Poilievre has so, you know, obviously in language, at least in rhetoric and in focus, sort of taken the Conservative Party to the right to eat up some of the PPC ground. I do think that the sort of farther right opinion and voters, I think that is a thing that exists and is pulling the Conservative Party in that direction. But I don't know whether the PPC and Maxime Bernier have much of a future as an organization. It does, you know, I can't remember the last time I read anything about Maxime Bernier saying or doing anything since that by-election, really. And so it does kind of feel like that their moment has passed, even if the kind of the popular sentiment or opinion that they represented, I think, is still a significant force in Canadian politics.
All right, just a quick lightning little round. The big issue that isn't the big issue, obviously, housing, cost of living, inflation, the U.S. presidential election are obviously the main kind of issues of 2024. But Stephanie, what's like one of the other issues you're really going to be watching that you think we'll end up talking about more?
That's a good one. I mean, I do think, unfortunately, there is something to be said at the way in which the Middle East war is creating a lot of tension in our country and a lot of divide and a lot of uncertainty. And it's raising a lot of questions about free speech, and it's raising a lot of questions about protest and what that means. And as the war continues, sadly, with no end in sight, the repercussions in our own society will continue to reverberate. And there are questions there about how we deal with that as a country, how our political leadership chooses to deal with it. And I don't mean on questions like votes at the UN and sort of the foreign policy implications of the Middle East, but what I'm talking about is the domestic implications of that conflict, rising levels of hate, insecurity. These are bad things for a country to be grappling with, and how we manage through them will say a lot about who we are. So I think that we will still be talking about that. Again, I don't think anybody would like to still be talking about it in 2024, but I think it's there and something for us to need to deal with.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think Steph's onto something, like not even just the Middle East war, but foreign affairs writ large. India, China, the war in Ukraine. I think these are going to continue to be issues that the federal parties are going to have to position themselves on and take positions on. And as you've seen over the last couple of weeks, sometimes when you think there's a very united front on an issue like Ukraine, it's maybe not quite as united as we thought it was. I think it's also important to remember that there is a foreign interference inquiry that's supposed to be starting soon. And for a couple of months there, that was an earth-shattering story before we all forgot about it. So I think there is still stuff, to come out of that, and we'll see where it lands. I think the other issue will continue to be, it's not a policy issue, but I think will continue to be Justin Trudeau's leadership. I still don't get the sense that it's particularly threatened, but I will continue to wonder whether if the polls are really, really bleak, let's say next summer, do people within the party start to push for a new leader? Does his situation become tougher than it is right now?
All right. Well, it turned out to be a far more interesting year than you usually get 2 years into the middle of a mandate. So we'll see what happens next year, if things will continue to be, quote unquote, interesting. What's the old proverb? It's
may you live in interesting times.
Yeah, and not meant in a positive way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, I hope that, the next couple of weeks you have some time to relax, take a break, and recharge for the next year. So wishing you happy holidays and a good new year, and hopefully it'll be a good new year for everybody, including the people listening. And I really appreciate you joining me today and going over some of these things that we've all experienced and observed over the last 12 months.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks so much. Merry Christmas.